Picture a soldier on a battlefield in the early 1800s, reloading his musket. He stands upright, fully exposed, pouring powder down the barrel, ramming a ball into place, fumbling with a firing mechanism, a process that takes 15, 20, sometimes 30 seconds, while enemy fire cracks around him. For centuries, this was simply how war worked. Every soldier, on every side, reloaded standing up, slowly, vulnerably, firing perhaps 2 or 3 shots per minute at absolute best. Now picture a different soldier, just a few decades later, lying flat on the ground, nearly invisible, working a small bolt with one hand, firing 5 or 6 times in the same minute, without ever once exposing himself the way his father's generation had been forced to. The weapon that made this possible was called the Dreyse needle gun, and it did not come from an army, or a government laboratory, or a team of military engineers. It came from a single locksmith's son, working for years in near obscurity, in a small German town, chasing an idea most established gunmakers of his era considered impractical, unnecessary, or simply impossible. This is the story of how one determined inventor quietly rewrote the rules of warfare and how his creation went on to reshape the balance of power across an entire continent. To understand why the Dreyse needle gun mattered so much, you first have to understand exactly how limited firearms still were, even after centuries of gunpowder warfare. For hundreds of years, the dominant infantry weapon was the muzzle-loading musket, a weapon loaded entirely from the front of the barrel, one careful step at a time. A soldier had to pour a measured charge of gunpowder down the muzzle, follow it with a lead ball, often wrapped in cloth or paper, then ram the entire load down the barrel using a long rod before priming a separate ignition system, and finally firing. Every single one of those steps had to be performed standing upright, since gravity itself was required to drop the powder and ball down the length of the barrel, meaning a soldier reloading a musket was, by necessity, standing fully exposed to enemy fire during the most dangerous seconds of any battle. The rate of fire this allowed was painfully slow, typically 2 to 3 shots per minute, even for well-drilled, highly experienced soldiers under ideal conditions, and considerably slower under the chaos and terror of actual combat. If you find these kinds of stories fascinating, how a single overlooked inventor can quietly change the course of history, take a second to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the ones coming next. Now, back to the problem that had defeated gunmakers for over a century. For generations, inventors across Europe had dreamed of solving this fundamental problem, of building a weapon that could be loaded from the rear, the breech, rather than the front, allowing a soldier to reload quickly and, crucially, while lying down. But breech loading presented an enormous engineering challenge. Sealing the rear of the barrel tightly enough to contain the explosive force of firing, while still allowing that same rear to open easily for rapid reloading, was a problem that had defeated gunmakers for well over a century. The difficulty was fundamental. When gunpowder ignites inside a barrel, it generates tremendous sudden pressure, and any gap at the rear of the weapon would allow that pressure, along with dangerous hot gas and flame, to escape backward toward the soldier's own face. Earlier attempts at breech loading had repeatedly failed on exactly this point, producing weapons that were either too dangerous to fire or too fragile to survive repeated use in the field. Numerous inventors across multiple countries had attempted partial solutions over the preceding decades, some clever, some ingenious, but none had managed to combine reliable sealing, rapid reloading, dependable ignition, and rugged durability, all in a single weapon affordable and practical enough to arm an entire national army. This is the world into which Johann Nicolaus von Dreyse was born, in the German town of Sommerda in 1787, the son of a locksmith, a trade that would give him an intimate hands-on understanding of intricate mechanical parts and precisely fitted moving components. As a young man, Dreyse traveled to Paris, where he worked for a time in a workshop associated with the famous Swiss gunmaker Jean Samuel Pauli, an inventor who had himself been experimenting with early breech loading designs and self-contained cartridge concepts, ideas that were at the time genuinely ahead of their era. Pauli's workshop was in many ways one of the most advanced firearms laboratories in the world during this period, a place where the fundamental assumptions of gun design were being actively questioned, and where ideas that would not become mainstream for decades were already being sketched, tested, and argued over. This period appears to have been formative, working amid some of the most advanced firearms experimentation happening anywhere in the world. Dreyse absorbed ideas that most gunmakers back home had never even encountered, and he returned to Germany carrying the seed of what would eventually become his life's defining work. Back in Sommerda, Dreyse did not immediately produce a finished rifle. Instead, he spent his early years building a successful business manufacturing percussion caps, the small ignition components used in the firearms of the day, a venture that gave him both the financial stability and the deep practical experience with ignition systems that his later work would depend on entirely. It was this hands-on familiarity with exactly how firearms ignited, gained not through theory, but through years of manufacturing the components himself, that would eventually lead him toward the single most important insight of his career. The core insight that would eventually make him famous centered on one deceptively simple question: how does the gunpowder inside the weapon actually ignite? In traditional firearms of the era, ignition came from an external source, a spark or a percussion cap struck on the outside of the weapon, sending flame inward to reach the powder charge. Dreyse's revolutionary idea was to move the ignition source, in a sense, into the cartridge itself. His design used a long, thin firing pin, a needle, which is exactly where the weapon's famous name comes from, that would drive forward when the trigger was pulled, piercing through the paper cartridge, passing through the gunpowder, and striking a small percussion charge located near the base of the bullet itself, igniting the powder from within. This was a genuinely novel approach, and it took Dreyse years of patient refinement to make it work reliably, developing not just the needle firing mechanism, but the entire self-contained paper cartridge, the bolt action system to load and seal it, and the precisely machined components required to hold everything together under the violent pressure of firing. The bolt action itself was arguably just as important as the needle. By designing a cylindrical bolt that a soldier could operate by simply turning a handle up, pulling it back, inserting a fresh cartridge, and pushing it forward again to lock, Dreyse created a loading system that was dramatically faster than anything a muzzle loader could offer, and one that could be performed entirely from a prone, protected position. By 1836, after years of development, Dreyse had produced a working, refined version of his needle gun, a bolt-action, breech-loading rifle, firing a self-contained cartridge, ignited by an internal needle, a combination of features that placed it years, arguably decades, ahead of nearly every other military firearm in existence at the time. Recognizing the potential of his invention, Dreyse presented it to the Prussian military, one of the most disciplined and forward-thinking armies in Europe at the time, and after a period of evaluation and testing, the Prussian army officially adopted the needle gun in 1841. The decision to adopt was not without controversy. The weapon was expensive to produce, required entirely new manufacturing techniques, and demanded that soldiers be retrained in an entirely unfamiliar method of loading and firing, a significant investment for any army to undertake based on an unproven technology. Perhaps even more significantly, Prussian military leadership made the deliberate decision to keep the weapon secret for as long as possible, understanding that its greatest advantage lay not just in its performance but in the fact that their rivals had nothing comparable, and did not yet even fully understand what the Prussians were quietly building. This secrecy was maintained with remarkable discipline. Production was carefully controlled. Details of the weapon's exact capabilities were guarded, and for years, rival nations underestimated just how significant a leap the Prussians had actually made, dismissing early reports or failing to grasp the tactical revolution the weapon truly represented. For over 2 decades, the Dreyse needle gun remained the Prussian army's carefully guarded advantage, refined, manufactured, and distributed throughout their infantry, while soldiers trained relentlessly in the new tactics its rapid, prone firing capability made possible. This long period of secret preparation mattered enormously. It was not enough simply to possess a superior weapon. The Prussian army spent years developing entirely new infantry tactics, built specifically around what the needle gun could do, teaching soldiers to fight from cover, to fire from the prone position, and to exploit their rate of fire advantage in ways their opponents were completely unprepared to counter. The true test of the weapon came in 1866, during a conflict now known as the Austro-Prussian War, a brief but decisive struggle between Prussia and the Austrian Empire for dominance over the German-speaking states of Central Europe. The Austrian army, by contrast, was still largely equipped with muzzle-loading rifles, weapons that, while accurate and well-made, still required soldiers to stand and reload slowly, in the same fundamental manner their ancestors had for generations. The result on the battlefield was dramatic and, in places, genuinely one-sided. At the decisive Battle of Königgrätz, one of the largest battles in European history up to that point, the difference in firepower proved devastating. Prussian soldiers firing rapidly from concealed prone positions could unleash several shots in the time it took an Austrian soldier to reload once, standing exposed the entire while. Austrian tactics, still built around the older assumptions of slow-firing muzzleloaders, often emphasized aggressive bayonet charges, sending massed infantry forward to close the distance quickly, a tactic that had made sense for centuries, but now sent soldiers charging directly into a volume of rapid fire their commanders had never anticipated, with catastrophic consequences. Eyewitness accounts and casualty figures from the campaign told a stark story. In many engagements, Austrian units suffered losses several times heavier than the Prussian forces opposing them, not because Austrian soldiers were less brave or less well-trained, but simply because they were bringing an older generation of technology and older tactics built around it into a fight where the rules had quietly fundamentally changed. The psychological effect was significant as well. Prussian infantry, able to fire from cover and reload without standing, held a confidence in combat that their exposed, slower-firing opponents could not match, a morale advantage that compounded the already substantial difference in raw firepower. The Prussian victory was decisive, and observers across Europe took immediate, careful notice. The Dreyse needle gun had not merely won a battle. It had demonstrated, unmistakably, that the era of the muzzle-loading musket was over, and that the future of infantry warfare belonged to rapid-firing, breech-loading weapons fired from cover. The impact rippled outward almost immediately. Military powers across Europe scrambled to develop or acquire their own breech-loading rifles, understanding that any army still relying on muzzleloaders was now dangerously, unacceptably obsolete. Ironically, the very success of the Dreyse needle gun accelerated its own eventual replacement. Its dramatic performance spurred rival nations to develop improved designs that would soon surpass it, addressing the needle gun's own real limitations, including a firing needle that tended to weaken and break with repeated use, and a breech seal that allowed some gas to escape backward, reducing power and occasionally troubling the soldier firing it. Within just a few years, France had fielded its own needle fire rifle, the Chassepot, which improved upon Dreyse's design in several important ways, most notably with a superior rubber breech seal that contained gas far more effectively, giving it greater range and power than the very weapon that had inspired it. But none of that diminishes what Dreyse actually accomplished. His needle gun was the weapon that broke the centuries-long dominance of the muzzleloader, the design that proved decisively and publicly that a soldier no longer had to stand and expose himself to reload, and the innovation that forced every major army on Earth to rethink infantry warfare from the ground up. What makes the story so remarkable, in the end, is where it began. Not in a government arsenal, not in a well-funded military research program, but in the mind and workshop of a single locksmith's son, who spent years quietly refining an idea that established experts had largely dismissed. Dreyse did not set out to reshape the balance of power in Europe. He set out to solve a specific stubborn mechanical problem, how to load a weapon quickly and safely from the rear rather than the front. And in solving it, he set in motion consequences that reached far beyond anything a small workshop in Smyrna could have contained. Every bolt-action rifle that followed, and there would be millions across every major conflict of the next century, owes a direct debt to the principles Dreyse worked out alone, decades ahead of his time. Johann Nicolaus von Dreyse was eventually ennobled for his contribution. The von added to his name in recognition of the weapon that had helped make Prussia the dominant military power in Europe. A rare honor for a man who had begun his life as a provincial tradesman's son. Somewhere in a modest workshop in a town most people outside Germany had never heard of, a locksmith's son spent years bent over tiny mechanical parts, chasing an idea nearly everyone around him thought was a waste of time. That idea went on to end the age of the musket, decide the fate of empires, and quietly lay the foundation for nearly every rifle that would follow, all because one man refused to accept that a soldier simply had to stand up and expose himself to death every single time he needed to reload.